Thank you very much. Actually, there's a slight correction to that introduction, though, which is that it's more than 35 years. It's actually 40 years. We're coming up on the 40 years. So actually, I thought that was very, very much, appropriate. I was very pleased to get the invitation to come here. And even as my two previous speakers said, basically, I'm very honored to come here and speak at Beida. I first came to China in 1990, and in the first morning of the first day in China, I met Professor Tang Xiaoyan, and she went around China with me, many cities, and we have been working, and I've learned so much from her. And so I have still learning so much from her. So it's very much an honor. And also, Professor Zhang Shichu, she has rescued me on various training programs in the past. Back in 1998, I remember particularly one in Guizhou province. Her and her team have done a really excellent job. So it truly is an honor to be part of this. And I don't think she knew that it was 40 years exactly when she invited me. I literally finished my academic training as an environmental engineer back in 1973, in December of 73. And in January in 1974, I started out as an engineer, environmental engineer, working in the Chicago area of the US. And mostly I was working on big coal-fired power plants, okay, to do the pollution control. So I started off doing that, and it seemed to me that even I was an engineer, all anybody ever wanted to talk about was economics. Okay, they just wanted to talk about how much is all this going to cost. That's what they really wanted to know. So what happened was, as our regulations changed in the US, people became more and more, and the economists began to influence some of the environmental thinking. So in 1981, I became an emissions broker. I was actually an emissions broker in 1981. I look around the room here, and I see that many of you were never even born in 1981, okay? Many young people here. Well, my brokerage lasted about 6 months. I didn't do too good. I didn't make a lot of money. And if you sell things about the market, you live by the market, you die by the market too. So I went out of business, but it got me very, very interested. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania to study some of these sort of ideas about environmental economics. And then in 1990, I got an invitation from the UN to come to China, because I had some background in engineering and coal plants and some experience in economics. It was kind of funny in 1990, the UN, when I went up to meet with them in New York, they were worried about sending me to China because they said I looked too young and I didn't have any gray hair. Well, now I have lots of gray hair and lots of gray hair. Nobody worries about me coming to China anymore, okay, with all that gray hair. So what I want to do today, hopefully, is talk to you a little bit about this idea that sort of follows my career of engineering to economics, and then we'll talk about price to quantity as well. So I'd like to talk about those two transitions, then let's talk about China, and then let's talk about where does all this go, where are we going to go in the future. Okay, engineers see the world very differently than economists do, okay? And if you're an engineer, everything's a process. We're going to see a black box there with things going in and things going out. And that could be a car engine, it can be a boiler, it could be a power plant, it could be a refinery, it could be a city. Okay? And what's going to happen is we're going to use all these inputs and outputs. We're either going to tackle what's going in, or the process, or what's going out, or we can link what's going in and out in a performance standard. Now, if you go back to like the 1800s in Britain, even then they were talking about using the best practicable means of pollution control. And they just thought the technology was good enough, okay? Whatever happened, if everybody's doing the best that they can, then whatever happens to the environment, hey, that's what happens. That's their thinking. Well, by the 1960s in the US and in other countries in Europe, we thought that wasn't quite good enough. We really were interested in the environment. We weren't interested in the technology. And technology changes all the time anyway. So what we did was we set up that scheme on the left where we used environmental quality standards and we had technology to accomplish those standards. And luckily, by the 1960s and 70s, we had computer programs that we could try to link what was happening in the technology with what was happening in the environment. So when I was a student coming out in 1973, right after the Clean Air Act in the US was passed, that's the world I grew up in, and that's the world I went to school in, okay? Now, on the right-hand side, we have a different way of thinking about the world, where we're going to have the marginal abatement costs are equal to the marginal social benefits. And we're going to use price instruments like taxation and quantity instruments like emissions trading. What I'm going to suggest to you is that there's two transitions. The first one is happening, but I have to be very careful and qualify this, which is that it's only happening in the bottom part of this figure. We're not going to use economics to set our goals. We're going to keep the environmental quality standards, but we're going to now use these tools, price and quantity, to accomplish the environmental goals over what I call on the engineering side. That's the first transition. The second transition is price to quantity. And this has a very strong cultural implications. Most of the world, like China and Europe, are very comfortable with taxation. Governments know how to tax. They've been doing it for millennia, okay? The United States has always been a country that hates taxes. You knew in the Boston, you may have heard about the Boston Tea Party, okay? Well, when they tried to tax our tea, we threw it in the harbor instead, okay? Government, and today, you may have heard about the Tea Party in the United States. Some people have said that stands for taxed enough already, okay? So they don't like taxes in the Americans. Now, I always get in trouble when I show this slide with my economist friends, because they say, what are you talking about, price to quantity shifts? These are two different tools. It's like having a screwdriver and a saw. You don't talk about a transition from a screwdriver to a saw. That's ridiculous. You use a screwdriver when you want to put in a screw, and you saw when you want to cut the board. So you use the right tool at the right time. Well, we'll talk about this in transition, okay, when we get to that. But it's a very important point. Okay, so why engineering to economics? Well, a couple reasons. The first one being that governments can focus on the main target and then let the market figure out how to do it. When we talked about all those boxes and inputs and outputs, the government had to set very specific standards in each of those cases. And in the West, at least, and in most parts of the world, governments don't do that particularly well. So we want to have the government set collective goals, which is important, but then let the market figure out how to accomplish it. You don't want the government telling you what valve to turn. Governments aren't good at that, okay? We can get economic efficiency, okay, because the right people are providing the control. And then I told you earlier that we don't live in a world where we exactly set the goals using economics. So what that means is that we can be more aggressive in protecting the environment. And finally, and this is what the economists really think is the most important point, is that every ton costs money. You wake up in the morning and you're trying to figure out how to get rid of the pollution, because pollution, either through a tax or a quantity scheme, it costs you money, okay? You internalize the externality, as an economist would say, okay? But again, remember, it's only happening in the top, or excuse me, the bottom. It's not happening at the top, okay? Now, what about this price to quantity? Well, in fact, as we said, there's a lot of different things you're going to look at. What's fixed, what's respond. If you fix price, quantity is going to respond. If you fix quantity, the price is going to respond. And then you get into a lot of technical questions, and most economists, for the most part, truthfully, feel much more comfortable with price-based systems, with taxation schemes, just like governments are. But there's a couple factors as we get into the cultural factors and the political leverage that really have led to this sort of shift more and more towards quantity-based schemes. And the first one is that there's a question about efficiency, but there's also questions about the politics and the distributional factors. And this shows that the political economy of these elements is really the key. You notice that first one talks about a carbon tax, and the person's trying to figure out whether this is a government initiative good for the environment or an environment initiative good for the government. Okay, you get that wealth transfer associated with that. So economists come up with all these ways to try to take that money and now get it back somehow into the private sector through these tax rebates, tax dividends, and things like that. But taxes are always very, very, very unpopular. No matter where you are in the world, in China, in the US, in Europe, taxes are unpopular, okay? The quantity-based approach allows us to separate some of the environmental effectiveness from the politics. And you literally have two questions. One is the question of how big is the pie? In other words, how many emissions are you going to allow? And then the second question is how you're going to slice that pie. And what we did in the early 1990s in the US was we had an acid rain program that we separated the cap, the size of the pollution control, from the way that it was allocated and sliced up. But we allowed the government, what happened was it went into Congress. There was about 30 special deals that were done under the acid rain program. Everybody wanted to be treated special. Everyone wanted a bigger slice of the pie. And the pie kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But what happened was we allowed EPA then to ratchet it down. And the way EPA ratcheted it down was they did that preserving the political bargaining that went into it. So that was a powerful, powerful tool. A couple years later, when Clinton and Gore tried to do the same kind of thing with a tax, what happened was everybody still wanted their exemptions. They still had the 30 special deals, but every time they did that, the people, if you had a special exemption, then it reduced the environmental effectiveness and it reduced the revenue coming in. So both of those things, finally, there were so many people that had so many exemptions, the whole thing just collapsed. So the quantity, it allows these are political reasons, okay? We also have tremendous flexibility in terms of distribution on whether you're going to auction or grandfathering, okay? And you can grandfather to everyone. You can go at 100% or 0% or anywhere in between, okay? So that's very, very powerful for a political system. If they need money, they can auction, okay? If they want to reduce political resistance, you can give it away through the grandfathering. And not only can you give it away, but you can give it away to whoever you want to give it away to. Okay, so these are powerful, powerful reasons for politicians, not for efficiency economists, but for political reasons. We see this queue-based system can avoid that wealth shift from the private sector. And in fact, as you know, if you studied some of these systems like in Europe, we actually get it moving in the other direction. You can literally be giving a public good, in a sense, allocations to the private sector. That's how the big power companies did very well under the EU ETS. But we're using markets and brokers and exchanges and all this kind of stuff. And mostly the money's not going through the government. If it's a tax, it's going to the government. Then the government can send it back again, but everything's going through the government, whereas the quantity-based schemes don't do that. So finally, you can see that it's really a question about not efficiency, but politics. And that's why I talk about a price to quantity shift. It's for political reasons to help get these environmental things done, as opposed to the efficiency characteristics. Theoretically, both price and quantity give you the same level of efficiency, okay? But, most economists, for various reasons, come down on the price side. But politicians, by far, come on the quantity side. And you can literally go back 25 years ago and say the ideological issue is, in some ways, is as deep and as old as socialism versus capitalism, on price versus quantity as well, okay? Now, we didn't just look at this question and say, oh boy, those economists, they're really smart people. Let's go do markets. No, that didn't happen at all. What we ended up doing in the time before I became an emissions broker was we kept all the engineering stuff, all the technology stuff, all the environmental quality goals and everything. But what we did was we set up a trading program that used the baseline, and the baseline was all the command and control requirements that we had. And then we allowed people that were over the baseline to be able to trade with people who were under the baseline. So when I was a broker in 1981, I was brokering emission reduction credits. Well, many of you sort of know that this is coming because you see this sort of two different ways of thinking about the world. The way engineers would do trading, which is a baseline and credit, and the way economists trade, which is putting all the emissions in. So in the baseline and credit, we're only trading very small amounts. But in the credit trading, in the allowance trading scheme, the way an economist does it, we put everything in. All the emissions are in the marketplace. So what happened was when we set up an SO2 emissions rate trading schemes in the US, we had the local air quality and we had command and control. We had the local air quality in 1976, which introduced the trading of credits. Then we had the acid rain program, which was an economist kind of an approach, and we're still doing it today. We literally set up a new program to deal with PM 2.5, but we're having trouble with that in the courts, okay? And the courts have struck it down. It was supposed to go into effect last year, but right now it's before the US Supreme Court. So what's happened is that we have all these things working together: credit trading, allowance trading, command and control. Now you can see that the same kind of thing, as you know, is happening in the carbon markets, where we had the Kyoto Protocol, we had 2 credits and 1 allowance type of instruments, and you know China did very well under the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, which was a credit trading. The EU, mostly they were selling to the EU ETS with allowances, and that's very similar to what China's now doing with their 7 pilot projects. We have VERs in a voluntary market. You know China started off that way with the VERs, and basically, you know, that's the same thing with China CERs, okay? So you can see how this kind of scheme has really played out. Now China has an illustrious history, millennia of experience. Today, even today, MOF, the Ministry of Finance, wants to do carbon taxes. NDRC is pushing the trading. So there's these big political battles going on, as we all know. China has a lot of experience. I did my first lecture at Beida in 1990 about emissions trading. Okay, and so we know that China knows about these things and have been exploring these and have done it in various places leading up to this. We know that they set up the emissions exchanges in 2008, basically 2007. It wasn't based on wonderful theory. We had the Chicago Climate Exchange, where the people who did that, Richard Sander, he had formerly been with the Chicago Board of Trade. He got $1.1 million from a foundation and turned that into a company that ultimately became it was worth close to $1 billion. He ultimately sold it for a little over $600 million. So people in China were looking at that and saying, wait a minute, if this guy can do it in a country like the US, okay, where they hadn't taken a Kyoto constraint, okay, and they were doing it voluntarily, you could do the same thing in China, but there's a lot more opportunity. So that's how we got the exchanges in Beijing and Shanghai and Tianjin. And he was a part owner in Tianjin, as you know. Okay, well, you're going to hear more about the 7 pilot trading. We're not going to talk about that. I just want to spend just 2 minutes or 3 minutes talking about the future. I wrote a paper back in I think it was 2009, excuse me, that is called Emissions Trading in China, a Conceptual Leapfrog Approach. Because one of the things that I see happening, I talk about big data is coming. That's really bad English because data is a plural, so it should say big data are coming, okay? But the bottom line is that what's happening is information is revolutionizing the world. You already know all that. But what it can be done as well is to try to think about how you might use information in China, because your problems are big here. So you want to be using every single possible way that you can think of to use information. So my paper laid out ways that you might think about using information in terms. They're not interested in that. That's not the kind of high technology that China wants. So this is something obviously the younger people should be thinking about, okay? Because one of the ways that you're going to have to use is use information, use technology, use this kind of information to tackle some of these very severe problems. You can do it. This is old technology. This was literally 3 or 4 years ago that I was here exploring this kind of stuff. So it's possible. China has this was an article I'm sure you saw in Nature last year, and it says that China can do it. No question about it. Can China lead? You have to solve this data problem, data gathering and information issue, but it seems to me that that's key. I'm going to finalize this with another thing going back to 1973. This was a book that was published that was based on a dissertation at Yale University in 1973. And he wrote this book that was very well received. But it was interesting because I was reading this, I was looking back over my notes when I was thinking about 40 years of environmental protection. And this book I read back when it came out in 1977. And he suggests that the countries like the US and Europe are going to have some trouble because market-based economies, okay, literally some of the political systems, the governance is not designed for times when they're designed for growth. And when you get into constraints, they're not very well designed for that. But he looked at China in that book, and he was writing this in 1973, so Mao was still alive, okay? And he was talking about the things that were good that were happening in China. He suggested that China might have a problem when it started industrializing more, that was going to be a problem. But he did say that China could live with a level of social regimentation that was slightly different than some of the Western economies. So he offered these 2 points, basically ecological self-restraint or social regimentation, or failing those 2, the brute forces of nature. So that's our question. We really have these ways. I think we have opportunities. I think information and high technology use of that information is going to change the world pretty dramatically, but it's going to take your generation to do it, okay? Those of us who have been doing this and have a lot of gray hair, we're not going to do it, okay? That's your job. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it.